So previously, New Perspectives hosted Dr. Sumitra Basu, a psychiatrist deeply interested in the interplay of Aurobindonian metaphysics and mental health. Dr. Basu has developed a model of consciousness-based psychology, and along with our guest speaker, Dr. Michael Miovic, authored a book soon to be published on the subject. And in their book, titled Consciousness-Based Psychology, psychopathology and counseling are approached from an entirely new perspective that arises from the experiential teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. So as a guide for today's webinar, extracts from their soon-to-be-published book, Chapter 6, has been sent to all participants. And if you did not receive it, I'll be typing the link to the extract in the chat box shortly here. But today's topic is sure to be intriguing and interesting and likely to generate many, many questions from our attendees. So if you could kindly type your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat, and then during the latter part of the webinar, Michael will address time permitting. So with that, Vladimir, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Radha. Yes, the name of the talk today will be about consciousness-based psychology. Yeah, we will get an overview of the forthcoming book on consciousness-based psychology by Dr. Sumitra Basu and Dr. Michael Miovic. Emphasis will be placed on some of its groundbreaking aspects, including the use of psychiatric medications by spiritual seekers, occultism, and the possession model of illness. A few case studies from the book will be shared, covering topics such as an alien abduction, suicide, and the mother's supramental experience of LSD. Let me briefly introduce Michael Miovic. He's a general adult psychiatrist with over 20 years of clinical experience in the US in both outpatient and medical psychiatry settings. He has written a number of articles on Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga psychology and collaborated with colleagues in the US and India to help develop this field. So without further ado, I will request Michael to address the audience. Please, Michael.
Welcome. So thank you so much to both of you for organizing this, inviting me, and also just the venue that you provide for other speakers is so fabulous. It's a great, great service, Radhe and Vladimir. Thank you. So I know that some of you have already been to some of Dr. Basu's talks on this, and so this is continuing certain aspects of it. We have the joy and honor of having Dr. Basu on the line. So during the question and answer session, he will certainly be able to address some of these issues of occultism in psychiatry because he practices, in that model. So Dr. Basu and I have spent the last several years pulling together a book on the topic of consciousness-based psychology in the light of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. And it's currently sort of under review with publishers. It's a big book, and so there's no way I can sort of review it all in this 1 hour. What I chose to do was to present one chapter in it that I think really presents in a very small space some of the most important concepts and clinical facts, and really gives a clear idea of what's novel about this approach. So that's why I'm doing this chapter. I will try to focus as much as possible on some of the clinical scenarios because Dr. Basu, I know in previous talks, has already explained the background, the metaphysics, the philosophy, Sri Aurobindo and Mother's yoga. The other contextualizing factor that I think is important in psychiatry is, we are a narrative field. Stories matter. And so knowing something about my background, I think will help you understand the context. So I grew up in, practice in the United States. which is the most materialistic country in the world. Not materialism just in the sense of money, but just in the total obsession with matter and physical things that we have, which is both good and bad. Its bad points are there, but its good points is matter is divine, and so there is a divine possibility there. I never wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be a writer, some kind of philosopher. And I was basically forced into medicine because I couldn't survive. I was earning about $3 an hour, which was less than minimum wage at $5 an hour. And so my mother finally cajoled me. She said she'd pay me $500 a month if I'd studied to get into medical school. So I needed food, so I did it. And and behind my human mother was the mother, the big mother, who obviously wanted me to learn something. And the whole medical experience has been very eye-opening to me because it's all about matter and mechanism, which was something that I was not much interested in constitutionally. And so I've been humbled again and again and again in the medical field. Because there are no Aurobindonians in the medical field. I'm the only Aurobindonian psychiatrist in the United States. And there's a couple of Aurobindonian psychologists. And as I like to say, the Sri Aurobindo community, we are the smallest religious community in the United States. There's no smaller community than us. You get any smaller? Well, there was the Shakers. There was one last Shaker who died 10 years ago. And so, so then we became the smallest community. I've had to learn a lot and to accept the fact that, all these non-Aurobindonians who are running the healthcare system, they really do know things, and they know things that I don't know. And I have to learn from them. And you want them around. This medical knowledge, this mechanistic knowledge is not something to be rejected. You will be worse off if you just kind of push it over there and say, oh, it's not yoga. So I've been very humbled, and it's been kind of an exercise for my ego to learn to accept this. This really comes to bear in psychiatry because psychiatry, modern psychiatry, has really become very mechanistic. For people who don't know, psychiatrists no longer do therapy in the United States. We don't, we prescribe medications. That is our role. Psychologists do talk therapy, and social workers do talk therapy. And psychiatrists prescribe medication. And that is not to be belittled. The power of medications is formidable. And you do not want to get rid of this mechanistic knowledge. It has helped an enormous number of people. Just because it can't help every person every time doesn't mean it's useless. And just because there are problems it can't help doesn't mean it's useless. It has its limitations, but it is something to be respected. And so that's just important to put out there. Whatever we want to do, if we want to be integral, we are going to have to accept the role of medications and other biological approaches in treatments. And so we need a worldview that allows for that in a very friendly way, not a half-hearted way. It has to be whole and open-hearted. And if I can make just an aside, without, sort of opening a whole can of worms, we've seen this in the last year with the whole problem with COVID. I'm in the medical community. I believe in vaccines. If you see what vaccines have done in the United States to stop the pandemic, you will not want to get rid of mechanistic knowledge. Yeah, 1 or 2 people in a million die of a vaccine. How many die from COVID is infinitely more. So all of this to say that, mechanism has its place. It is part of what we need to understand. And the genius of Sri Aurobindo is that he understood this way back in the 1920s. when psychology was still 100% psychological. Freud knew nothing about biology. So in the 1920s, Freud was sort of ruling the world. Psychoanalysis was the rage. And Sri Aurobindo already understood that the brain is real and that there are physical mechanisms going on in the brain. And so that's what I'm going to talk about here. The best place to start with this, what I call the interaction model that Sri Aurobindo had of how physical and superphysical things interact with each other, is the possession model of illness. So that has been studied by medical anthropologists, and who look at it as a cultural construct, and that's a valid approach. But we know from the yoga perspective that sometimes it's not just cultural. Sometimes it's actually real. It's not that they think that they were possessed. They were possessed. All right? It happened. And what do you do? And so I think all of you hopefully have the Word document that Radhe sent around. And I wanted to start with an amazing letter from 1923 in which Sri Aurobindo is writing to a father about a child who appears to have come under occult attack. And then this is the letter that he says. I think it is best for me to state the case in its worst and not only its best possible terms, because it is necessary that you should know the full truth and have the courage to face it. These cases are not those of a truly physical malady, but of an attempt at possession from the vital world. And the fits and other physical symptoms are signs, not of the malady itself, but of the struggle of the natural being against the pressure of the hostile influence. Such a case in a child of this age indicates some kind of accumulation in the physical heredity. Note that, physical heredity. He is saying that there is something physical and genetic that is part of this problem, creating an opportunity or a predisposition of which the vital invasion takes advantage. That is the Aurobindonian genius. He has just said that there's an interaction between biological factors and occult factors, and they're both part of the process. It is especially the physical consciousness and the physical vital which contain the germs or materials of this predisposition. The physical being is always changing its constituents, and in each period of 7 years, a complete change is effected. If the symptoms of this predisposition in the nature are detected, and a wise influence and training used by the parents to eradicate them, and this is done so effectively that in the first 7 years, no seeds of the malady appear, then usually there is no further danger. This is pure genius. So he's explained that there's an interaction between the physical and the vital worlds, and he's also said that there's development. He's laid out the concept of psychological development in children decades before Piaget did this in the West. If, on the contrary, they manifest by the 7th year, then the next period of 7 years is the critical period, and ordinarily the case would be decided one way or the other by or before the 14th year. And then he describes 3 possible outcomes. And you also notice how clinical he is. He's calling it a case. I mean, he is writing this like a doctor would write it. There are normally 3 possible eventualities. The difficulty in dealing with the case of so young a child is that the mind is not developed and can give no help towards the cure. But as the mind develops in the second 7 years, it will. That's what Piaget said. Abstract relations happen in the second 7 years. If it is not abnormally weak, which I think is not the case here, react more and more against the influence. Aided by a good control and influence, it may very well succeed in casting out the hostile intrusion altogether. Then he goes to the second possibility, is that the struggle between the natural being and the intruding being may not be decisive, in the psychic sense. That is to say, the intruder cannot take full possession, but also he cannot be thrown out entirely. In that case, anything may happen: a shattered mind and health, the death of the body, or a disturbed, divided, and permanently abnormal nature. That's a very serious outcome. And he's, describing it very clinically. The third and worst possibility is that the intruding being may succeed and take entire possession. In that case, the fits and other violent symptoms will disappear. The child may seem to be physically healthy, but he will be abnormal and most dangerous being, incarnating an evil vital force with all its terrible propensities and gifted with abnormal powers to satisfy them. So that is an amazing letter. And, it shows that he understood childhood development, cognitive development, the interaction between physical and superphysical things. And he even makes a distinction between sort of transient fits and seizures from an attack and full possession, in which the signs of the struggle disappear completely. And that he mentions the importance of physical heredity as creating kind of a gateway. And then he goes on in a different letter, in a different part of, the letters on yoga, where he talks a little further about this kind of interaction model between physical and superphysical factors. And so in the 1930s, when he was writing letters to the disciples, he made a series of really amazing clinical observations. One is he talked about epilepsy and says that it's not possession. It's an attack, or at most a temporary seizure. But insanity always indicates possession. The hereditary conditions create a predisposition. It is not possible for a vital force or being to invade or take possession unless there are doors open for it to enter. The door may be a vital consent or affinity, or a physical defect in the being. So right there, he has again really clearly highlighted that there are physical defects that are gateways and predisposing factors. We'll get to those later, but those physical defects presumably are in the brain. He then goes on in this letter to talk about other things, about how insanity is due to a vital attack or possession, although there's often a physical reason. He talks about hysteria, which we describe now as personality disorder. He also mentions delirium, which is just amazing. I'm blown away as a psychiatrist that he knew what delirium was. And he diagnosed it correctly. He says the cause of delirium is physical only, which is exactly what psychiatrists and neurologists say today. Delirium encephalopathy is an organic state, brain failure caused by any number of factors, infections, medications, illnesses. We see it in the hospital a lot, and it's really a physical condition. And so, really, in psychiatry, that's why it's not considered a psychiatric condition. It's actually considered a medical condition because it's 100% organic. And it's treated with medical treatments. And Sri Aurobindo mentions that there are some sort of lower vital forces of nature that are involved in it, but he doesn't really sort of consider it anything more than a mostly physical condition. So it gives you right off the sense of how astute Sri Aurobindo was, and how far in advance of the field of psychiatry. So he's absolutely right about delirium, and we now know it's true. The entire field, that's how it practices. He's also right about this interaction between hereditary, physical things and vital attacks. So today, we can study those physical defects a lot more. When he wrote this, there was no brain imaging. Today, we have CTs, we have MRIs, we can get amazing pictures of the brain. We have PET scans that can delineate all various kinds of functional pathways and receptors. We have EEGs. that can study electrical activity of the brain. So we know so much more about the structure of the brain, neural circuits, receptors, neurophysiology, all the hormonal effects on the brain, the effect of psychopharmacological medications, what they're doing in the brain. So much. I mean, there's the study of neuroscience is vast and it's exploding. I mean, the neuroscience knowledge that is going to come forth in the next 50 years is going to be staggering in its power. The medical field is kind of advanced on that line in oncology, where, for many reasons, they've been able to be more successful. But that's going to come in neuroscience too. It's just a matter of time. But all those kind of refinements in what we know about the physical structure of the brain, that adds detail to what Sri Aurobindo said. But it doesn't change the basic concept that there's some kind of the defects in the brain and neuro circuits can be gateways to hostile forces. And that understanding is really very useful. So we'll get to some cases about possession soon. And Sumitra works openly in this model and has tremendous experience. And, if you go to sort of outside industrial Euro-American culture and get into Latin America, for instance, or Africa or India, lots of traditional cultures really accept the phenomenon of possession. And I've spent a lot of time in Latin America, and it's understood. I mean, it's part of the culture. People accept these things. It's really not certainly not in the hospital where I work. I can't go around saying, "Oh, look at that, you've got a hostile attack," So I'm just not allowed to talk like that. But what's amazing is that, what I say to people who kind of wonder, like, well, gee, where would we really see this in the United States or Europe rather than some village in Brazil, is Stalin and Hitler. So we have, in the West, we have had two of the really great cases of possession that caused an enormous amount of death. I mean, Hitler and Stalin, between the two of them, killed over 60 million people. It is really staggering, the amount of death and the impact that they had on Europe and the globe is phenomenal. And so we have time is short, but the mother, I put in some of her statements about Stalin and Hitler and really very acute observations about the difference between Stalin and Hitler. But these are hostile forces that are behind them, and had a tremendous negative effect. And for people who really doubt this, like, well, are these hostile forces really real? You can still go to the concentration camps in Poland and Germany, and you will feel it. The atmosphere is just toxic. I mean, everyone who's been there describes the impact. Many people cannot go. It's so disturbing. They feel it. So, this is very, very real. And you can go find the evidence of it right in the middle of Europe if you want to really get into it. So I wanted to kind of come back to, well, how might this apply now, say, here in a materialistic country like the United States? So there was we've had this debate in our culture about UFOs and aliens, and it's in the news again. If you notice, there's been a new revelation sort of that the government is declassifying information and basically saying, yeah, there are a phenomenon out there. We don't know what they are. We're not saying they're aliens, but the Navy and the Army have started to decommission some of their video. Barack Obama just came out and talked about and said that, yeah, he saw stuff that shows that there are these unknown phenomena. They don't know what they are. So this was big in the 1980s. There was a whole phenomenon of people in the United States reporting that they had been abducted by aliens. and subjected to abuse, which they said then created psychological problems. So how do you understand this? It led to, of course, a huge debate in the mental health literature back then in the 80s and early 90s, where the traditional materialistic psychiatrists are saying, oh, these people are just all delusional, and yet it's not a delusion that's treatable with medication. And there was a famous Harvard psychiatrist named Dr. Mack who interviewed about 30 or 40 of these people and did kind of barbital interviews where he would try to help them remember what happened. And he came out and wrote a book saying that he thinks it's true, that they were abducted by aliens and subjected to abuse. And this then created, a huge ruckus and fight in the 1990s with everyone saying, "Oh, how unprofessional, that is, that you're just supporting these delusions." So I won't get into Dr. Mack's story. Is sort of interesting. He was a very provocative Harvard professor, and some people speculate that maybe he didn't believe it. He just enjoyed the provocation, which is possible. But the bigger question is, well, how do you understand this? And this is where an Aurobindonian perspective can lead to a different way of conceptualizing it. So in the United States, it was really structured as an argument between two kinds of materialists. There was one group of materialists who's saying, there are no aliens, they aren't real, you people have psychiatric problems and you're delusional. And the other group of materialists were saying, yes, there are aliens. They flew here from across the galaxy in this super advanced technology, and they're doing all of these things. And the US government, has these burned corpses and remnants of UFOs that it's hiding in Area 52, and there's a gigantic conspiracy to conceal the physical evidence. So two kinds of materialists are arguing with each other. And nobody considers another possibility, which is, what if these alien experiences of aliens and UFOs are really superphysical? Suppose that it's real, but the experience is really happening on some subtle physical plane or some vital plane, and people are then giving it a physical explanation. And in that case, both sides would be right. That in one sense, it's not physically true, it didn't happen. But the other side is, well, something did happen. So when I was a resident in 1998, I had a case that really illustrated this to me in the most vivid way. So I had a Haitian patient who has had schizoaffective disorder and would go through bouts of depression and psychosis and get suicidal. And I was treating her with whatever we had, which is medications and therapy, and this sort of limited success. And so she, after kind of had been through some hospital admissions, and I clearly wasn't getting her better, she decided to go back to Haiti and do a voodoo healing. So Haiti, as you know, is a country that has a very rich and vivid sort of understanding of the supernatural and the superphysical, and a whole cultural tradition of voodoo spirits, and a lot of that comes from Africa originally. And so very much kind of normative to their culture. I'm not against it as an Aurobindonian, and I also knew that I was really not getting her better. So I said, okay, fine, I hope it helps. So she went to Haiti and did this kind of amazing ceremony in a graveyard in the middle of the night, where she's in a wedding gown and an open casket, and various rituals going on to exorcise the voodoo spirit. And it worked. She had a complete remission of symptoms for about 3 or 4 months and felt great. And then she came back and slowly got worse and worse again, and ended up back in my office suicidal. So I had to just following the trying to save life, I had to send her to the hospital involuntarily. And when she was in the hospital, she had an amazing experience of aliens. So she was in the group room doing group therapy, and she perceived that a UFO. She didn't use these words because she's not from the United States. So she didn't say alien and she didn't say UFO. She said this large round disc that looks kind of like a donut. It flew over the building, and then it sucked my spirit out of my body and pulled it up inside this flying thing. And then there were all these little creatures who started doing experiments on me, and they stuck needles into my abdomen and took eggs out of my ovaries. And I didn't say anything other than to ask. So I never had discussed this with her. I never even mentioned the word UFO or alien. So I never gave her any hints. And I asked her only one question. I said, do you think this experience was physical or not? And she said, no, it wasn't physical. It was spiritual. They pulled my spirit out of my body, and they did this stuff to me. And then they stuck my spirit back into my body and left. And so there you have it. Because she did not have a materialistic worldview, she was able to describe the superphysical experience of alien abduction in a non-materialistic way. And she had no exposure to UFOs. She didn't know what they were. I never talked about it with her. And actually, this experience kind of faded from her awareness and really didn't go on to become a cause of concern for her. What did was a persistent concern was the voodoo spirit that was antagonizing her, and so that continued to be a problem. So that's one example of how understanding that there can be an interaction between the physical and the superphysical can be very important, and it can give us a more broad and flexible way of talking with patients about what their experiences are, when without having to completely dismiss anyone, whether they're materialists or spiritualists. There's a truth to all sides. And that's the beauty of Sri Aurobindo's model, that it can see all these sides of an issue. So in this book, Dr. Basu, who has a very rich practice, and Vladimir has visited his clinic, as have I, and it's just absolutely amazing. And he practices openly in this model for patients and families who are interested. And so in this chapter, we go on to describe various types of occult influence. So one kind is subjective psychological formations that arise in the individual, family, or social matrix. Another is ill will by others towards the subject. And that can be like the quote, evil eye. And then there can be actual cases of hostile attack, influence, or possession by vital beings and forces. And so the first two of those types are kind of represent projections of human mental formations. So it's really the power of mental formations that is doing it. While the third is actually an occult force, a vital being or force that's coming from the vital world, not from the human world, and is doing that. So I am aware of, time, so I don't want to dwell. I've let people read. Dr. Basu has some really great case studies that he has about subjective psychological formations and how that happens. And so that's in the handout. And just wanted to, mention this case here of a lady doctor who suffered migraines, chronic depression, feelings of alienation and meaningless for 15 years. And she then told Dr. Basu that she had started to visualize her corpse hanging over her head, and this had become unbearable. Now, that situation was so severe that she had to be sent for ECT, which helped pull her out of the acuteness, and then they could continue work. So just a little reminder that even in the cases of these kinds of occult influences, there's a role for medications in ECT. And sometimes they may be part of the treatment to prevent suicide or prevent aggression or violence. So it's not an either or. We have to remain open to all approaches. Dr. Basu then also has kind of a nice section on perceived ill will by others. I won't go into detail there. He has very interesting cases of hostile attack and possession, and maybe some of these questions may come up in the question and answer session. He'll probably talk himself in question and answer about some of the interventions that he uses. I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about occult factors in suicide. Suicide is a really big topic in psychiatry, and our number one job obligation is to try to prevent suicide. And so, many cases of suicide involve occult factors that are affecting people. And so he has a section on that. I've talked about some of those occult factors that you can, for instance, feel if you go to like old concentration camps. And I wanted to talk also just a little bit about the interaction. So acute suicidality is like a great model of the interaction between occult and physical factors. So it's known that when people get acutely suicidal, they get flooded with overwhelming negative thoughts and urges to hurt themselves. And this is why it's so hard to predict and prevent suicide, because these episodes seem to happen kind of suddenly when a whole bunch of life factors collide, and they come on very rapidly within minutes to hours. So it's not something that we can just sort of easily run a math model on and predict and say, oh, we know this is going to happen to you in 24 days. And so some of the factors that come in are social stresses. So people losing jobs, losing breakups are a big cause, deaths, financial losses. Another big facilitating factor is intoxication. I mean, working in the hospital, almost, not all, but like over 90% of the cases of suicide attempt that I deal with involved people using substances, alcohol, drugs. And what's happening when they use those substances is two things. I mean, physically, it's affecting the brain, opening that physical gateway to hostile worlds. And we know that these drugs and alcohol, they carry negative forces. They're used by hostile entities and forces to perpetrate harm. So that role of substances in the phenomenon is really central, and understanding that it's both physical and superphysical is really key to understanding the whole picture. And then there's, other things that can play into suicidality, like mental illnesses that increase the risk of suicide. And those mental illnesses are also real. They're not fake. The mother and Sri Aurobindo have talked about covert attraction to hostile forces, how people, even if someone like the mother or Sri Aurobindo throws a hostile force out of a person, there's something in the person that kind of calls it back. And what that something is often quite psychological, and can be described in psychological terms, in terms of ego defects and vulnerabilities, whether it's narcissism, the desire to appear important and famous. There's also a high rate of occult influences affecting people with antisocial personality disorder. This is huge. I don't want to get into too much trouble, but if you look at the dictators around the world today, of which there are a lot, almost all of them have antisocial personality traits, if not the full-blown disorder. Just speaking of my own country, you can go to the Mayo Clinic website, type in antisocial personality disorder, look at that list of criteria, read about Donald Trump, and reach your own conclusion. I won't say anything more on that. So the last thing I had wanted to talk about is that the effect of goodwill. And this is also important for understanding the medical model. So we know that goodwill has an effect, an occult influence on people. And medical ethics and medical practice and medical science are an extended exercise in goodwill. It involves the collective effort of thousands, really millions of human beings across cultures, across times, dating back to the very dawn of civilization, who have dedicated themselves to reducing human suffering. And those ethics, in terms of doing good to others, collecting data, understanding basic science, delivering quality healthcare, all of those things, they create a force field of good. And that force field is important to fighting hostile forces. And one of the first things that hostile forces will try to underdo is to undermine reason and logic, and therefore the evidence-based practice of medicine. And we've seen this again in the whole problem of the conspiracy theories about vaccinations, which are definitely evidence-based, reason-based, and the conspiracy theories to undermine attempts at vaccination, particularly I can say here in the United States, I won't speak for elsewhere, but here in the United States, it is a hostile attack because these vaccines do good, particularly here in the United States. I mean, our data is excellent. We know these vaccines. And so I just wanted to kind of point that out. That's my last sort of plug for, to don't push away the mechanistic model. Try to, have this interactionist model that there are subtle forces and there are physical forces, and they're both important. And quality healthcare requires us to kind of take both of those seriously. All right, I'll stop there. 15 minutes. Questions, answers.
Thank you, Michael. It was wonderful to listen to this exposition so clearly given, and it reminded me before I go to the questions posted here. There are 8 questions, and we may also invite Sumitra to join us in the panel. It reminded me about the organization of the whole Vedic vision. We have this heaven and earth mental and physical consciousness, which holds within this space in between, or that what we call antariksham, or vital world. And those forces of the vital world always try to enter and to disturb us beings here, possess us. So all the physicality is actually built up from the vital force in a way, but it becomes a protection against those forces. And the same mental realm, the heaven, is another protection. We have 2 protections, so to say, holding us. One is the mental structure, and the other is the physical. And both of them, Sumitra is here. Namaste, Sumitra. And both of them are actually helpful to be healthy, to be oneself, to allow the soul, the psychic being, to manifest and to meet those forces. And every time these forces try to disturb, it will be through both, through mental and the physical. There has to be disturbance on both sides, as it were. And then they can enter. It's quite interesting what this holistic view or consciousness-based psychology or psychiatry that both are needed to be disturbed for the real possession or the real entry of these forces. And there's with us Sumitra Basu is here, so he may also address these issues. Thank you for this beautiful, wonderful exposition. And I'm glad that you're both here today. So it's wonderful to see you with this work. So shall we go into the questions? So I will start from the first one. Can you speak to the difference between weakness in the physical or neural construct, not able to handle the higher forces, versus possession because of the same or because of evil forces and working therapeutically or in spiritual sadhana? It's a very complex question. The difference most probably between this sadhana and not being able to hold the higher force and evil forces trying to enter, vital forces.
So this is, Sumitra has experience in this, treating people who've been pulling higher forces and can develop depression or hallucinations, other psychiatric symptoms because they've pulled more force than their system can sustain. Sumitra, do you want to make some comments on that, on those sorts of phenomena, the pulling of forces?
What you are saying, what Michael is saying is absolutely true. And together with that, there is also people who are doing sadhana and who have gone a bit inside and have an access to the inner being. And once you have an access to the inner being, then you are open to the cosmic consciousness. And then the risk is that from the cosmic consciousness, that hostile forces can enter into your being, unless you see you have to do a lot of other work also. It is not only that in sadhana that your inner being has developed, but the side by side that your psychic being has to be worked upon, and also in front the ego also has to be worked upon. No? So all these things it is not possible to do immediately. It takes years and years to perfect oneself, and so always there is a risk that one can be attacked by the hostile forces from outside. And just because one has become very sensitive or one has developed a bit of spirituality and has gotten access to the inner being. So everything is very risky when you are talking about sadhana and occult forces. Then things are becoming very, very complex. Now, if you are talking about ordinarily people getting affected by hostile forces and getting ill or getting possessed, that's one thing. But doing spiritual pursuit or doing spiritual work, and then you are having all this kind of occult attacks, then it opens up an entirely different dimension. I think we have addressed that, Michael, in that chapter on latter chapter. I think we have talked about spiritual emergency, and we have a whole section, not in this chapter, but but later when we talk about all these things and the risk of a psychopathological risk in spirituality. We have a very comprehensive section on that. Very different levels. Why inner being? While your passage from the outer being to the inner being, in that passage, in between that passage, there is an intermediate zone. And Sri Aurobindo describes that in the intermediate zone, if you can slip, then you can have all sorts of things, even like hallucinations and delusions and all, they can happen. So you see that how much risk is there involved in the whole process. Yeah. So we have a completely separate chapter because it is different dimension. We are bringing in spirituality and the risk associated with spirituality. So,
so I'll put in a plug to read our book when it comes out. There's a whole chapter. Whole chapter. Next question.
Thank you. Is adult paranoid schizophrenia a form of possession?
Yeah, well, I think it will depend on cases. We know that there are physical defects that are causing what we call schizophrenia. In the future, probably there'll be many different kinds of schizophrenias based on the particular neurophysiology. But those brain defects are there, and we've imaged them and studied them, and we know that they're real, and that they start very early. Actually, those things start neurodevelopmentally, probably in utero. Did you want to say more on that, on possession and schizophrenia? You see a lot of that.
This is a very complex issue, and because schizophrenia is a very big umbrella, it includes many types of people, many types of cases. So that there might be cases where you can understand that there is a very clear vital position, but there are other cases where they are very open to negative forces which are all around. So there is a wide variation. So by position, we don't always mean that formed vital being has just come inside and has possessed you. It's not always like that. One is always open also to the negative forces all around. So there are many, many variations in schizophrenia, because it's a very big subject, and many types of people, we classify them as schizophrenics. So some of them may be, or it might be that they might succumb to the negative forces. Even if they are not possessed, they can succumb. For example, if a person who is not in a perfect frame of mind, and he is crossing, we have seen this in India, and has gone to a railway crossing where a lot of suicides and accidents happen, then the negative forces there can just influence and overwhelm that person. Yeah. So you see that it is happening at a different point, when one was broken down so much that one just caught the negative vibrations which were there in one place, which is a type of thing that that happens in India when you have so many level crossings, and when you have these accidents and suicides are always happening. You know, the way railway lines are there in India. So a lot of variation is there. A
lot of it. To kind of a simple take-home point for our diverse audience is, remember, there's an interaction between the physical things, neurophysiological things, vulnerabilities in the brain, and these occult forces. I have to say, though, that on average, people with schizophrenia are really lovely. They're some of my favorite people in the world. I call them as God's children, and I just love the schizophrenics. Most of them are really sweet, very gentle. They have good souls. They have good hearts. Some of the best wisdom I've ever heard is from people with schizophrenia, and so they have some little neurological, physical defect in their brain, and so what? Really, a much more dangerous, very little public harm is done by people with schizophrenia. The real problem is people with antisocial personality disorder who appear socially successful and socially accepted, and are really much more dangerous. They become heads of corporations and heads of state and international leaders, and they're considered, quote, normal, and yet much more dangerous. So keep it in perspective there. Don't bash people with schizophrenia.
Also, people who are not having delusions, not officially psychiatric patients, but people with overvalued ideas, who are demigurus or semi-gurus or cult leaders, or who impose their opinion on masses, ignorant masses. And so they do more harm to the people, and they are also possessed, but they are possessed by different kind of forces. Only poor chaps that the schizophrenics get all the blame, but actually they are doing more harm to the society. People with overvalued ideas, exclusive ideas. You see that more harm is done to the masses by them.
Right.
But they are also possessed. Also possessed.
Let me talk, because there is a question here and about Donald Trump, and I'm allowed to comment because I'm an American, so I'm not overstepping my bounds if I weigh in. But he did a lot of damage to the United States. He's still doing damage to the United States and the world as a result. And he meets all the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, except for, I don't think that he burned animals when he was a kid, but we don't know, he could have. But pretty much everything else on the list is there. He lies incessantly. My sense of him, he has an enormous vital ego. It's almost like pure vital ego, just a channel for untrammeled vital forces. of greed and selfishness and deceit and lying and bullying and exploitation and corrupt. There's just a pure channel for it, and it's very alluring to a lot of people. He has a glitter. They kind of like that wealth and the appearance of, I'm something great. And all that vitality, the vital energies, really undermine reason. I mean, we've seen that here. What's happened to the political discourse in the United States is truth is almost dead. Reason is gone. I mean, it almost doesn't matter what a fact is anymore. It's people are just pushing complete nonsense. It's very dangerous. And so that kind of person really is very, very dangerous and to the world. And they're seen, for a lot, 50% of Americans thinks he's wonderful and successful and would like to be like him.
I think it's a general trend in the world today. You can see more and more, as you rightly said, there's so many of these dictators coming up all over the world and trying to bring their own ideology. That's what is dangerous. The shift in the mind, which is serving this force.
My most favorite recent case of schizophrenia, I was called in the hospital to do a capacity evaluation on someone with schizophrenia who wanted to leave. He was getting IV antibiotics for cellulitis on his feet. He'd get foot infections because he's always wandering around outside in the cold, wearing out his shoes and getting infections. And the medical team said he needed more treatment and he wanted to go. So this was back during the elections. And so I go to talk to him and I ask, why do you want to go? And he says, well, because God is calling me to go help people. I stand outside and there's so many people who look sad and unhappy and I just need to pray for them. Oh, that's so sweet. I said, and do you talk to God? He says, oh yeah, I see Jesus all the time. And he tells me, pray for those people. They need help. And I thought, that is so lovely. And then I said, well, have you ever had, not that, but any kind of hallucinations or anything like that? He says, no. I mean, well, there's that one time in San Francisco in the 60s, I was in a clinic and the aliens had come and bugged it and they were listening to all of us. And, they were trying to control people. So I left. That's not for me. And then he stops and he says, but doc, I'm not crazy. If you want to see crazy, look at that. He points at the TV and there's Donald Trump. And he says, that is crazy, right? And I said, you can leave, you can go. And I told the medical team, the man understands the difference between right and wrong. Let him walk. So that's my little bit on people with schizophrenia. I love them. God help them.
Lovely. There is another question here. What should one do if medication of any other therapy or any other therapy doesn't work for psychiatric or psychological problems? And from whom to take help if it is figured out that the attack of hostile forces is taking place?
Well, I'll let Sumitra answer that. He's got so much more experience in treating these things. What do you say, Sumitra?
But it depends upon individual cases. There are cases, of course, where we reach a dead end from the medical model, and then sometimes we have to take help. And that is the sole reason that we included this chapter in occultism, because perfect psychology, it cannot be complete without metaphysics and without occultism. This is the sole reason that we included the chapter there, and this chapter deals with it. Michael has only given some abstracts, excerpts from that chapter, but it deals with it, how we can go with this problem, what are the ways in which we can deal with such subjects, such clients, and what are the usual avenues that can be practiced by therapists. And then there are certain areas where you have to take the help of more experienced people who are working with occultism. So it's a very big area. Of course, there is a place where you need to have an occult intervention in some cases. Otherwise, even the medicines don't act. So that's not contradictory. They are complementary to each other. You have to say that they are all complementary to each other. They are not contradictory to each other. When we had somebody, this is Natalie Tobert had come to see that how these occultists were sending patients to me, and then we found out that one Muslim Gaji Sahab one say a Muslim saint. He was sending patients, and he told, when we went and interviewed him, he told that he was segregating people who are possessed and who are not possessed. And then again, who are possessed, they also required modern psychiatric help even after his intervention, he explained. And then Natalie asked him that, don't you feel any inhibition because you are a person of mysticism, you are taking help of science? And then he had answered, let sadhana and gavesana go together. What is the harm? You see,
Yeah.
in a very remote village of Bengal near Bangladesh border, nothing is there, and there this person sitting there where there is no amenity, no electricity, nothing, and there that person is saying this thing, that sadhana and gavesana go together. So we must always think that these are complementary. Then I think it will be much easier, because as we say, as Michael said, that the energy that Goodwill carries by the therapist, that also acts. In many cases, it is not more than the medicine, it is the goodwill of the therapist, which is also acting as a motivating factor.
Absolutely.
And that all these things add to these, the well-being of the people, well-being of the person. So, of course, I will tell. And I think that this chapter, if you're interested, you should go it, and you can then understand the basic priorities that you need if you are to be a counselor, or if you need to be a therapist. Then you should know the basic. Some of the basic facets of occultism that you must know, and then you can develop it and you can take help from others. But then you must be very cautious, and you always have an open mind, and always think that it is a complementary to our things. We should not be exclusive with one thing or the other. Then we'll be dogmatic people. We have to have a very flexible mind, and we don't know now who is working, what goodwill is working in what level. Michael, another thing, I was just remembering when you were talking, that sometimes the schizophrenic patients who are very stable for many years, and suddenly there is an unpredictable movement. Suddenly there is some homicidal urge or something.
Right.
You can't explain it unless you bring in the possession model.
Right. And
there is no explanation.
Yeah, Sumitra, I think you also at the end of the book have a great case of how the inconscient rose up and caused a case of murder, inexplicable murder, right? Yeah, this can also.
Somebody has asked a question about LSD. I think Michael will tell that as a separate chapter, and that you just give a brief.
That's a whole separate thing, and we're out of time. Sorry. But it's now becoming a popular topic again. LSD is in the news. Its research is expanding. Everybody's going to want LSD now. And the mother has an amazing couple of comments on the LSD in the agenda, 2 sections over 2 years. So that would be for another talk. Psychedelics.
There is another question here about the COVID second wave in India. How could you explain it from the point of view of consciousness-based psychology?
Well, on the occult factors. Yeah. Well, I've perceived occult factors behind COVID. Sumitra, you've had an even more direct experience of that. But there are occult factors. Do you want to comment, Sumitra, on the...
You tell what you want to.
Well, mine are simply, I at the beginning of the pandemic, I experienced the kind of force of greed and heavy industrialization and really money. I had a whole vision of like Wuhan, China, where all I saw was money changing hands through thousands and thousands of iterations of money. And then I felt the force of the attack coming through that. And I mean, to me, it's, just something about all this international greed and corruption and money and industrialization and degradation of the earth, all of these forces that are, attacking the world is certainly part of it. But Sumitra also had a more direct experience of the entity.
Yes, but then I will tell something else. I'm not talking about that direct experience, but my friend who is with me, actually, he was so long, he was here, who stays with me, because my Sharmila and my wife and daughter are there in Pondicherry. So in Calcutta, my friend stays with me, and he was meditating in 2019 in the beginning, and suddenly he called me in the morning that, sir, I'm seeing a very old man, very in a dilapidated state, sitting besides me while I'm meditating, and I'm seeing only dead bodies and dead bodies and dead bodies. And the first lot of dead bodies are not Indians; they are yellow skin. and it is only dead bodies that are coming. And you see that man that he was describing fitted exactly the man of sorrows in Savitri, in the Triple Soul Forces chapter. So then we had an inkling that something is going to come. It was ordained that this is going to happen, and that he was seeing that enormous. And I frequently ask him that, do you think that time has come, that amount of dead bodies he was seeing, that we have finished with it? He says, no, sir, something more has to come, because it is much more that I had seen. So all these things happen. As Michael, you must remember that before the tsunami happened that year, in the beginning, that you had that experience that the sea was rising and Shiva came and stopped it. And so all these natural catastrophes also, they are also in a way ordained beforehand.
One sort of comment I can make is the other side of the equation is, Mother and Sri Aurobindo say these hostile attacks, these occult forces, they come to make us stronger. Point out weaknesses, point out defects that have to be overcome, challenge us to grow to overcome them. And I can say certainly in the United States, the COVID pandemic is the reason Trump wasn't reelected.
But I also feel together with it, there are many parallel reasons running, but I also feel because the next step of evolution is scripted in the cellular consciousness. The reason why Mother worked with the cellular consciousness, did a cellular yoga, and that is why the hostile attack is occurring also at the level of the cell, by something which is at the same time, which is non-living and living. So that kind of thing that is coming and attacking, because it is the next evolutionary step has to be taken, that the script is there already encoded in the cellular consciousness. And that the time has now come for that to work. And whenever we do any good thing, we have obstruction. And when now this kind of work has come, when this evolution has to go to the next step from that level, then that attack naturally has to come at that level also. So I'm not saying that this is one cause, but there are many parallel causes. I feel that this is also one reason.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you described, that interaction of different, even hostile forces are actually directed by something which is evolving.
Yeah.
And as Mother, it clashed Hitler and Stalin in some way. These forces had to clash because they were both anti-human forces, anti-evolutionary forces. And so that great war actually was the solution for. Otherwise, if one of them would dominate, it would be much worse. So in a way, there is always way out through the situation given. And this is another view of Sri Aurobindo, which we can learn from him.
I was thinking that one thing, that a very small way that we could do, that sometimes when we sit in meditation, that we concentrate on the subtle physical, each one of us, we concentrate on our subtle physical, and then at the subtle physical that is merging with the subtle physical of the cosmos, of the cosmic consciousness, and try to feel that the light is being brought down there, just as Sri Aurobindo's poem where he brings down the light into the brain, that golden light. So you can also do that. You just conceive, I was just thinking, and I was just also trying to do it, that to concentrate on the subtle physical and let that subtle physical be one with the universe is subtle physical, and then bring the golden light there and praying to the Mother that it must not be penetrated. The subtle physical must not be penetrated by these vital forces like this virus. So it must be protected from that. So the work has to be done at that level, so that the in the front the cells are protected. So this is something like that, innovative things that we could also try to and find out how we could bring it at the very practical level.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this beautiful exposition and very, very interesting. I hope we continue the dialogue and exploration of these topics, because we didn't answer many questions. Unfortunately, we didn't have time, but these questions will come back, and I'm sure there will be more questions even, because we are in the need of this particular hour. We have to know how to handle these forces and to become free from them, move forward, evolve. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Sumitra. That was a beautiful session.
Nice talk.
Nice.
Hopefully you invite us back again.
I'd like to thank you both too. And my thought is, as we did with you, Dr. Basu, if you both are open, we could schedule like a Sunday morning here, evening there, Q&A session just to follow up on the many questions that didn't get answered in this session, and go from there, because I think that worked really, really well last time that we did it with you, Dr. Basu. So we'll follow up with both of you on that. And I would just like to make a couple announcements before we leave. Next weekend is a holiday here in the U.S., Memorial Weekend, so we will not be hosting a New Perspectives. However, the following weekend on June 5th, we will be hosting the U.S. Sri Aurobindo Centers, and they'll come together to share their focus and their future direction, their programs, their study groups, and more. And so we hope you all will join us to learn a little bit more about what's happening here in the U.S. and how the Mothers and Sri Aurobindo's vision is manifesting differently in the U.S. from place to place. So that's June 5th. And then the following 2 weekends, we are very excited to announce that this year we will be doing our Sri Aurobindo Integral Yoga Retreat online due to COVID situations. And that means that we can open it up to everyone, not only here in the US, but in India and elsewhere in the world. So it will be June 12th and 13th, and the subsequent weekend, 19th and 20th. The theme this year is Navigating Through Evolutionary Crises. And we have as keynote speakers Dr. Alok Pandey, Shraddhalu Ranade, Nadid Eggenberger, and Dr. Vladimir Yatsenko. So it will be mornings here in the US, the Eastern Coast, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., and that means in India, 7:30 to 10:30 at night. Also optional yoga and pranayama in the morning and in the afternoon. We hope you all will join us. We'll be sending out another email notice in the next day or two. And if you can, please try to sign up early. We have an early registration discount price of $50 for the 4-day program, and that'll be good until June 1st. So hope to see you there. And one last quick announcement. We would really love the feedback from everyone that was able to attend today's webinar. And so when you close out of Zoom, you will see a feedback form pop up in your web browser. And if you could just take a few moments and provide us with your feedback, would be very helpful for us, as well as both our speakers today. So your input's very important to us. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.